Hello everyone, welcome to this lecture on grief, fear and Wimbley woos, an introduction to trauma in children's literature and its archives. My name is Helen King. I'm a PhD candidate at Newcastle University, and I'm also doing a collaborative partnership with 7 Stories, the National Centre for Children's Books, also here in Newcastle. My research itself is on representations of displaced and refugee children in children's literature. And so some of the examples that I'll be using with you today are from such texts. The first example that I'd like to show you is from such a text. So this image on the left here is from The Arrival by Sean Tan. And this is a wordless picture book that shows the journeys of several refugees and groups of refugees towards a strange new country where they meet and share their stories. So this image on the left shows a couple standing in what could be the remains of their bombed out city. So you could see these shapes as buildings which have all been uprooted from the ground and are standing at these odd angles. But I think that this image is just as representative of the psychological experience that this couple are going through. These threatening objects crowd in on the image and overhang them and are just abstract enough to be able to represent the psychological trauma that this couple have gone through in their city being destroyed. And this is one of the things that trauma fiction does. It's not just about depicting traumatic events, but it's about depicting the psychological wounds that result from them. And such recourse to abstraction and metaphor is one way of doing this. And there are many other strategies that we will be exploring over the course of this lecture. The main question I'm asking here then is, how is trauma represented in children's books and its archives? But more precisely, how do texts represent grief, fear, conflict, and death within a field of literature that is often thought of as protecting the innocence of its child readers while offering them some sort of valuable moral lesson? I'm going to begin by discussing literary trauma theory with its origins in Freudian psychoanalysis, through to the first wave of trauma theory, sometimes known as the classic model, and the second wave of trauma theory in the last couple of decades. And I'm going to use an example from my own research about how these theories can be applied. I'm then going to move on to discussing trauma specifically in relation to children's literature and some of the theoretical concerns that arise when we're bringing trauma and children's literature into dialogue with one another. And I'm going to use some items from the 7 Stories archive to illustrate this. Finally, I'm going to introduce Wed Wabbit, your set text, and suggest some ways of exploring this novel through a trauma theory lens. First of all, though, what do we mean when we talk about trauma? So trauma is borrowed from Greek, and it means wound, literally. You might see this word used in relation to physical wounds, but in this sense, we're talking about psychological wounds, this sort of wounding of the mind. Trauma is the result of a traumatic event or a series of events or a set of life circumstances. But it's important to note that there's no set definition of what makes an event traumatic. It's not about the event itself. It's about the trauma is about the effect on the mind of the person experiencing it. The origin of a trauma, that traumatic event, could be anything from trench warfare, or it could be the loss of a loved one, or it could be the experience of being having to leave one's home as a refugee. Sufferers of trauma often describe being haunted by the memory and by the feelings in their body that they associate with the traumatic event or events. It's like a past won't stay past and continues to resurface in the mind and in the body in the present day of the person experiencing the trauma. Common effects of trauma include flashbacks, panic attacks, and dissociation, which is where the sufferer detaches from the event, from the memory, or from the world around them in order to protect themselves from what they're experiencing. The origins of our understanding of trauma come from Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, who noticed some of the patterns that I've just described in some of his patients and wrote about it in Studies in Hysteria and then in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And so our modern psychological understanding of trauma owes much to him, but at the same time has evolved significantly since then and continues to evolve all the time as new research is being developed. So trauma theorists use Freud and other types of psychological research in a variety of different ways. So the first theorist that I want to introduce to you is Cathy Carruth. Her book, Unclaimed Experience, Trauma, Narrative and History, is one of the most well-known works of literary trauma theory. She is one of a group of theorists who were writing in the 80s through the 90s about how trauma is expressed in literature. But why is it that literary critics and literary theorists are so interested in a phenomenon that seems to belong to the realm of psychology? Carruth has an explanation for this when she says that literature, like psychoanalysis, is interested in the complex relation between knowing and not knowing. An essential part of trauma is that it is difficult to articulate, it's difficult to understand. It can be described as unknowable, and yet it demands to be known at the same time by resurfacing in flashbacks and some of the other behavioural patterns that I've already described. Literature is concerned with metaphor, with symbolism, with the unconscious. And so literature can actually be the perfect ground for exploring this relationship between knowing and not knowing that we see in trauma. Carruth argues that trauma is always the story of a wound that cries out, that addresses us in the attempt to tell us of a reality or truth that is not otherwise available. And what she means here is that writing about trauma is the attempt to tell this story that cannot otherwise be told. Trauma theorists, for this reason, look to literary texts for silences, for gaps, for disruptions in the narrative or disruptions in speech that point to this trauma. According to the classic model, trauma produces dissociation and it resists speech. This model of trauma assumes that language is insufficient to represent the traumatic experience, and that representations of trauma in literature then reveal the inadequacy of language. So I'd like to take a look now at how this can be applied to a children's book. So we're going to look at The Other Side of Truth by Beverly Naidoo. This was published in 2000. It's set in the 90s. The protagonist Sade and her younger brother Femi are from Nigeria, and their father is a journalist who is very critical of the Nigerian government, and because of this it's not safe for the family to remain in the country. After their mother is killed, the family flee to the UK using false passports. The father is put in a detention centre in the UK, and the children go into temporary foster care. So they have to negotiate the asylum system, the foster care system, a new school, racist bullies, and eventually the media, as they attempt to get their father's story on the news in order for him to be released. So the novel opens with the scene of their mother's death. And I want to show how this scene can be read through the trauma theory lens that I have just described. So I'll read the passage out for you here. Papa is kneeling in the driveway. Mama partly curled against him. One bare leg stretches out in front of her. His strong hands grip her, trying to halt the growing scarlet monster. But it has already spread down her bright white nurse's uniform. It stains the earth all around them. A few seconds, that is all. Later, it will always seem much longer. So I'm really interested in this final phrase, this later, it will always seem much longer. And I believe that Carruth says something that, that helps to illuminate what is going on here. So Carruth says that the traumatic event is experienced too soon, too unexpectedly to be fully known, and is therefore not available to consciousness until it imposes itself again repeatedly in the nightmares and repetitive actions of the survivor. So what Carruth is saying here is that the traumatic event is incomprehensible in the present moment. It's unexpected and it's impossible for the mind to process. And so this is why memories of it then return in disruptive ways, in nightmares and in flashbacks. And this is what happens in The Other Side of Truth. So in her waking hours, Sade is able to do what she describes as slamming down the shutter in her brain to prevent the recollections of her mother's death. But her trauma returns to her in her dreams. So this third passage that you'll see on the screen here is a nightmare that she has when she's arrived in the UK, about 100 pages after the initial traumatic event of her mother's death. And you can see it's almost exactly the same word for word. There are some small differences, but it's almost the same as the passage above. Both are in the novel as a whole, overall is in the past tense, but both of these passages are in the continuous present tense, and they're also italicized. And this represents a disruption in the linearity of the novel. These passages represent a different time signature. They represent a past event coming in and disrupting the progression of the narrative. Another key facet of Carruth's model is that trauma is unspeakable, that it resists language. And this is also something that we can identify in The Other Side of Truth. Sade thinks to herself when she's prompted to tell her story to a social worker, how could she ever put the terrible pictures in her head into words? The full horror of the trauma of her mother's death is unspeakable at this point and seems to defy representation in language. So to summarize all of this, the classic model of trauma says that trauma is unspeakable and unknowable. It says that trauma resists linguistic representation, but surfaces in nightmares and flashbacks for the sufferer, and in gaps and silences and disruptions in literary texts. It says that trauma causes dissociation, and it says crucially that this model is universal. This model says that trauma and its representations in literature always operate like this. However, in the last couple of decades, a lot of different theories of trauma have emerged, and these theories push back on this idea that the model of trauma can be universal. They push back on the idea that trauma always operates in the same way. This is sometimes known as second wave trauma theory, or as the pluralistic model of trauma. And this model, or rather models, we should say, of trauma theory operate in two ways. They insist that trauma operates in a multitude of different ways that are specific to the social or cultural context of the sufferer. And they pay attention to the variety of different ways that language and literature can and do represent trauma. So the pluralistic model is less concerned with developing a universal model of how trauma always works, especially because the underpinning psychology is constantly evolving. It's more about exploring the huge variety of ways in which trauma can be experienced and which it can be represented in literature. So I'm going to look at a couple of theorists who promote this kind of approach. The first theorist is Michel Balayev, And she's the editor of this collection, Contemporary Approaches in Literary Trauma Theory, which is a really useful text for exploring the pluralistic model of trauma. And she says that this model moves away from the focus on trauma as unrepresentable and is more interested in the specificity of trauma that locates meaning through a greater consideration of the social and cultural contexts. And what Belayev argues is that just as we are each embedded in a social context that shapes how we perceive and how we understand the world, so trauma occurs in a particular social context, and the way it's experienced and the way that it's written about is shaped by that social context. I'm going to turn to the second theorist to look at an example of how this can work. So Greg Forter, and the essay that I'm drawing on is also included in that collection that I just mentioned. His work is on post-colonial trauma theory. He argues that the potential for traumatization is a constitutive feature of colonial or race relations, in as much as these are always and everywhere relations of domination. So what he's saying is that colonialism itself can and is traumatizing. This is a model of trauma that isn't the result of a single traumatic event, but is the result of a continuous set of violent social circumstances, such as those experienced by enslaved or colonized people. And Forter argues that fiction dealing in these subjects, and he uses the example of Beloved by Toni Morrison, he argues that this sort of fiction uses strategies that witness to what he calls psychosocial trauma. This is a type of trauma that can be experienced by an entire community or by a society, and a type of trauma that has an ongoing social cause. And rather than focusing on its unrepresentable or its unspeakable qualities, fiction about this sort of psychosocial post-colonial trauma often use literary representation as a call for justice. He says here that trauma can often appear as ghosts of an historical violence, one to which we can but have not yet been able to do justice. So the representation of this kind of trauma is not just to show trauma and say, look, this is unspeakable, this language is disrupted by this traumatic event, but rather it's to this sort of writing can call for justice in the present. So I want to turn to the other side of truth again to explore how we can interpret this text, also using the kind of model that Greg Forter describes, this model of psychosocial trauma. So Nina Faisal and Alan Stein outlined that refugee children experience 3 stages of traumatic experience. One, while in their country of origin, that's stage 1. Secondly, during their flight to safety. And thirdly, when having to settle in the country of origin. So the type of trauma that I was talking about before is really only about the initial event in the country of origin. But I want to talk more about this third stage, the trauma that is experienced when having to settle in a country of refuge. And I argue that this is the sort of, in the other side of truth, this is the sort of psychosocial trauma that Forter describes, which is the result of a set of social circumstances experienced by refugees in the UK. So this is Sade as she's thinking about her father, who's in a detention centre, and she is thinking about him lying on a narrow metal bed in a cold, dark cell with only a tiny barred window for light. Someone in a white coat, like Hawkman, grasping Papa's hand, forcing his fingers onto an ink pad. Handcuffs snapped onto Papa's wrists. Sade tried to chase these pictures away. So this is a trauma that results from Sade's encounter with the bureaucracy of the British asylum system. And this is not a one-off encounter, but it's a social condition in which she is in. It's a series of encounters that place her in a constant state of fear. She comes to describe several spaces within the UK as the territory of the eyes, and this includes the detention centre where her father's kept. It includes various airports that she has to move through, and it also includes the asylum screening unit where she and her brother are fingerprinted. And this trauma, like I've said, is not so resistant to representation in language, but is tied up with this call, with this call for justice that this text makes, and with the justice that Sade goes on to seek for her father in trying to get him released. So just to recap the pluralistic model. The pluralistic model of trauma that I've just described says that trauma and its representations exist in a cultural and a social context. This model says that trauma can be experienced collectively as the result of ongoing social injustices. It says that trauma can be represented by language in a variety of different ways, and this model looks for the ways that it's represented. And finally, representations of trauma, according to this model, can also be calls for justice in the present. What I want to emphasize here in describing this pluralistic model or models of trauma to you is not that we need to bin out Kathy Carruth and the classic model of trauma. That model is incredibly useful and very important. But what I would want to emphasize is that you can, that literary critics and us as those who study literature can draw on a variety of models. We don't just have to pick a certain model, but we can draw on a variety of different models and look for the different ways that trauma is represented. Okay. And now I want to talk about how these theories interact with children's literature. So I've talked about a plurality of theories that have developed in the 21st century about trauma, and theories around trauma and children's literature occupy a very important position here. And this is because children's trauma literature and the theory of children's trauma literature has a very unique set of concerns, and those concerns are related to the fact that it has a child audience. Much literary criticism about trauma firstly asks, should books for children depict trauma, grief, suffering, and evil at all? Is it right to represent these things to children? And if yes, how should this be done in a way that's suitable for young readers? So a lot of the literary criticism around trauma in children's literature comes out of Holocaust fiction for children. And critics of Holocaust literature for children are particularly concerned with these questions. And that's because, of course, stories about the Holocaust need to be told, partly to do justice to those who have been silenced in death, and also to educate about the extreme consequences of anti-Semitism, of hatred, of prejudice, of racism. And Adrian Kurtzer argues that for this reason, Holocaust pedagogy in young adult fiction remains inherently anxious, questioning its own effectiveness, even as it returns incessantly to looking for the right way to tell a history that has no happy ending. So what she's saying here is that whilst there is this need to tell stories about the Holocaust for children, the very fact of Holocaust literature disrupts some of our common expectations about children's literature, because you can't tell a story about the Holocaust and be honest about it and give it a happy ending. And yet children's literature, not always, but there's often this assumption that it will have a happy ending. So this is very specific to Holocaust literature, and none of the examples I'm going to go on to use are from this area of fiction. But I think that Kurtzer is saying something very important here about anxiety. And I think that this anxiety about how to tell these stories well and whether or not they're suitable for children, I think this anxiety persists whenever children's literature and trauma theory are brought into connection with one another. But I would also argue that far from being the exception, trauma, horror, death, and suffering are actually key features of many children's texts. We think about fairy tales. These feature often quite violent and gruesome stories with characters who are under threat of being eaten, of being roasted, of being turned into sea foam. Some of the earliest examples of children's literature in the UK, and this one is from the 17th century, feature really grim descriptions of hell in order to get children to behave. This here is James Janeway's A Token for Children, being an exact account of the conversion, holy and exemplary lives, and joyful deaths of several young children. And of course, how many children's books can you think of that use the traumatic death of parents as the starting point for their narrative? I've used The Secret Garden and Roald Dahl's James and the Giant Peach here, but I'm sure you can think of many more examples. So arguably, the stories that I've just described, they differ from the kind of Holocaust fiction that Kurtzer is talking about, because in those stories, in stories like The Secret Garden, in fairy tales, the trauma is either resolved or it exists within the narrative to teach the reader some sort of moral lesson or to serve some sort of therapeutic purpose. So there's a key difference that I want to highlight between literature that uses trauma to teach children a moral lesson or to offer them a therapeutic experience, and literature that that depicts trauma because children have a right to know, because they need to know that evil exists in the world. Kenneth Kidd has argued that there is some sort of consensus now that children's literature is the most rather than the least appropriate forum for children's work. I'd encourage you to read his article on this. All of my references are going to be the end of the PowerPoint. But he is saying something partly about the fact that children need to know about trauma and about a lot of the topics that we've discussed already, but also that children's literature functions in a certain way through its use of metaphor, through its use of symbolism to represent trauma particularly well. So I'd encourage you to read that article and have a think if you actually agree with him. But Kim Reynolds engages with this idea from Kenneth Kidd. And she says that although he's referring primarily to Holocaust literature and literature that deals with war and conflict, she says that he alludes to a more general willingness to explore dark emotions, damaged lives, disturbed behaviours, and characters whose distress is not relieved by the arrival of a fairy godmother, making it possible for children to encounter such emotions and situations on the page. These works are not only reshaping children's literature, but creating opportunities for young people to gain insights into themselves and those around them. So Reynolds is suggesting that allowing children to encounter topics such as those which we'll see in Wed Wabbit, perhaps, of parental death, help children to process their own experiences and also prepare them. It gives them an emotional framework to deal with death and to deal with hardship in their own lives. We're going to return to Wed Wabbit itself in a few minutes, but first I want to talk to you about the archive. So first of all, I'd like to return to the other side of truth. So one of the tasks of trauma theory, and one of our tasks if we're using trauma theory, is to explore the strategies that texts use for representing trauma. And I'd like to give some examples here. So this first one is from the Naidu archive, which is held at 7 Stories, and which I'm using extensively for my own research. So all of the stuff in the Naidu archive are things that Naidu has kept and herself donated to the archive. And these images here are from booklets which have been kept by Naidu, and they've been created by the Medical Foundation for caring for victims of torture. in her research and her development for The Other Side of Truth, Naidu corresponds with the Medical Foundation. There are lots of there are letters and emails between her and the Medical Foundation, and she seems to have used this contact to shape her representations of trauma in her novel. So I think these items can help us to answer a few questions. The first one is about trauma itself and about how trauma functions. The second is about the link between creativity and trauma. And thirdly, about Naidu's creative process and her processes of representing trauma. So you'll see, first of all, that both of these images include a drawing from a child who has been through psychotherapy with the Medical Foundation, and they have included this drawing in their booklet as a way of demonstrating some of their work. So this first image on the left, this child has drawn an image, and they talk about their secret book, and they say, "My dreams are very frightening. They are too frightening to say in words. In my house, in my country, many frightening things happened." So this child writes about their trauma as a secret thing, as something which cannot be said in words. This can refer us back to the model of trauma that we saw at the very start of this lecture, where trauma resists speech, where it can be unspeakable for the person experiencing it and then returns later in dreams. The second image here shows a boy crying as planes fly above and what seems to be a bomb is dropped on the ground below. And the handwritten caption below says, "This is a boy crying for his mum and dad, but he don't know they are dead." And the little caption above reads that this is a drawing by an 8-year-old Iraqi boy during his psychotherapy session at the Medical Foundation. So like I said, it can be assumed that both of these children have created these drawings in a therapeutic context, and they demonstrate something about how words fail for these children. But what they also say is that creativity, this act of creative writing and drawing, is available to them as a way of expressing their trauma. And within this psychotherapeutic context, creativity, engagement with stories, engagement with creativity can be used as a way of helping children to begin to process their trauma. But finally, what does this say about Naidu's creative process? So we've seen in this first image that this child talks about a story that they cannot tell, but which returns to them in their dreams, in their frightening dreams. And this is how we can describe Sade's trauma, right? As we've already seen, her trauma is terrifying to her and something that she can't bring herself to fully think about in her waking hours, but which returns to her in her dreams. And so we can see that Naidu may well have used this as her inspiration in creating her representation of Sade's trauma. But furthermore, Naidu's use and her preservation of these items shows that she is keen to base her representations of trauma on current psychological research and practice. She's keen to show that her representations of trauma are accurate, that they're authentic, that they are in line with actual psychotherapeutic work that is being done with refugee children. So the next example that I'd like to show you is from As the In-Between. So this book was published in 2012 by Sarah Garland, and a lot of the materials for it, a lot of the notes and the draft illustrations and the research materials are also in the 7 Stories archive. This book tells the story of Azzy, who is a young girl who has to flee with her family, with her parents, from her home country and seek refuge in another country. The country of origin and the country where she arrives it's never explicitly revealed where those countries are. so the reader is kind of left to assume based on their own knowledge, based on what's currently happening in the world around them, and based on the illustrations, you're kind of meant to make assumptions about where this may be. So as you can see from the cover of the book, which is similar to the Sean Tan example that I showed you before, Garland uses the destruction of the urban landscape in order to show the destruction of war, rather than showing the signs of war on the human body. There are no dead bodies depicted. There are no images of injured people in As the In-Between. And perhaps making the image of the damaged city stand in for all of the multiple horrors of war is a way of communicating the trauma and the damage of war without horrifying young readers too much. So the destruction of the urban space comes in to stand in for the wider destruction and the wider traumas of war. We can see Garland experimenting with her images of the war-torn city in the archive. So this image on the left is from the published book, and it's the opening pages, it's the opening page of the book, and it shows this country at war. It shows destroyed buildings, smoke, tanks, planes that are shelling. And the right-hand image is very similar. So the right-hand image is from the archive. This is a draft drawing that is stored in the Garland archive at 7 Stories. So it's similar to the first image. We have tanks again, we have shelling, we have broken buildings, but I'd suggest that it's more graphic. The use of colour shows the city on fire a lot more obviously. We see these flamethrowers being used. This soldier is much more of an obvious threat. His boot and the butt of his gun overshadow the frame. And we see these dying flowers crushed under his boots on the ground. And whereas in the image on the left from the published book, the reader isn't necessarily made part of that image. It's not sure how us, when we're viewing it, what position we are in. We could be looking at this scene as if we're there, or we could be viewing it on a TV screen or in a photograph. We're more distant from it. Whereas in this right-hand image, we are positioned in the frame as if we are on the ground or unable to look up at this soldier. We're like below this soldier's feet, who overshadows this whole image. A further look into the archive reveals this newspaper clipping, this photograph from a newspaper, which Garland has very clearly used as the reference for the soldier's boots in her illustration. You can see the angle is the same, the design of the boot is similar, we can see this gun pointing down at the same angle. If we look at the newspaper image though, the sense of threat in this image is very different. It's more complex, it's more ambiguous. The soldier's gun is angled towards this girl's face, and she looks up at him as if into the soldier's face out of the frame. And it's unclear why this soldier is there. Is he guarding these people to protect them, or is he threatening them? Are they being gathered somewhere? So if we're asking these questions about the strategies that Garland is using to communicate the traumas of war to a very young audience using a picture book, the juxtaposition of these two images is a really interesting one. This image of the boots in the newspaper article has obviously caught Garland's imagination as a symbol of fear and of terror. But why has she then chosen to transplant this image onto her drawing of the burnt out city? Is it in order to fit the narrative arc that she's trying to create? Or is it because the real image of the little girl who's at the point of the soldier's gun, is it because that image is too scary? And finally, what I'd like to note is that this image on the left, this sketch, is never actually used in the finished book. And it's worth asking why that is. Again, is it because it didn't fit into the narrative she's trying to create? Or is it because, as I've said, it draws the reader in to this traumatic scene in a way that she might have considered to be too horrifying, too traumatizing for the young reader? We can obviously, from these images, only speculate about all of these questions, but I would invite you to consider these images and to consider your own conclusions. So I'd like to move on now to talk about Wed Wabbit and how some of these ideas that we've talked about relating to trauma literature and trauma in children's literature can be applied to this text. So published in 2017 written by Lissa Evans, Wed Wabbit is it's sort of reminiscent of a novel like Alice in Wonderland, really. It features 10-year-old Fidge, her 4-year-old sister Minnie, and her hyper-fearful, hypochondriac cousin Graham. And the novel is a take on the sort of archetypal hero's journey. Fidge, our protagonist, begins the novel frustrated by a shopping trip, and she inadvertently kicks her little sister Minnie's beloved toy, Wed Wabbit, into the road, where Minnie follows and is hit by a car and taken to hospital. Fidge is racked with guilt. She is also angered by being sent to stay with her cousin Graham while her sister is in hospital. And the backdrop to all of this is that she's struggling to process the grief of her father's death 2 years before. As a result of all of these emotions, she is plunged into the pages of Minnie's favourite picture book, The Land of Wimbley Woos. And the rest of the novel is a sort of absurdist romp through her little sister's imagination. The Wimbley Woos are brightly coloured, they speak in rhyming couplets, and some wear moustaches that Minnie has scribbled in her copy of the book. The Wimbley Woos are also plagued by a new dictator, the overgrown and very stroppy Wed Wabbit, who is slowly sucking all of the colour out of Wimbledon as he grows larger and becomes more bloated and more angry. Fidge is accompanied into Wimbledon by Graham, by Minnie's toy elephant Ella, and by a plastic carrot that Graham carries around with him. Both the carrot and the elephant take on a sort of life size. They function as characters in the novel, and they take on sort of therapeutic roles, and they offer some wise and some very annoying words of wisdom. The group as a whole must team up, and they must solve a series of riddles and challenges in order to save Wimbledon from its new dictator, get home, and reunite Minnie with Wed Wabbit. But as with any hero's journey, this narrative is as much about the personal growth that the characters go through as much as it is about completing the task in hand. In order to complete the challenges set for them in Wimbledon, Fidge must learn to trust others. She must learn to embrace her emotions and overcome some of her guilt. And Graham must learn to be brave. He must learn to make friends and to work as part of a team. This novel is most suitable really for a reader of 7 or older, although these things are often more subjective than that, but it's for that age of reader, but it takes place in the world of a picture book for a much younger reader. Fidge, as the protagonist, is rather cynical about this world and about the books and the toys that her little sister plays with, and the narrative voice maintains a comic sort of distance from the novel's events. The reader is encouraged to sort of knowingly mock the childish world of Wimbley land, but yet they're still allowed to indulge in its childish pleasures. And in a review, Jackie Bryan notes that the authorial voice is very strong and wryly mature, with Wed Wabbit probably appealing most to readers ready to reflect on the books which they have outgrown. But more than this, I would like to argue that Wed Wabbit asks readers to reflect on the act of reading itself and to question the role of children's books in helping children process difficult emotions and supporting their emotional development. This is because whilst Fidge and Graham are cynical, and while they mock the Wimbley woos and they mock the childish world into which they've been plunged, it's through their adventures in this land and through their encounter with the Wimbley woos that they achieve their personal growth. The novel seeks then to weigh in on the question of whether reading can help children such as Fidge and Graham and perhaps Minnie overcome fear, grief, guilt, trauma. As far as texts that deal with trauma go, this novel is very light touch. Karen Coates mentions this when she says that in her review that Fidge's defensive pragmatism and Graham's skittishness are initially sad without being overwhelming. The portal fantasy and the verbal irony keep the emotional intensity at just the right pitch to frame their healing. Fidge's grief for her father and her shock and her guilt at Minnie's accident are therefore kind of contained within the fantasy land of the Wimbley woos. There's this sort of protective sphere of fantasy around her and around the reader in the way that the reader is allowed to engage with her grief. However, the trauma that she's experienced is very real, and the way that she represses it shows up in the opening section of the novel, which is in the real world. This is Fidge here as she reflects on her own coping mechanisms. It says that she'd found over the past couple of years that if she looked unbothered, she generally felt unbothered, and if she felt unbothered, then it didn't leave room for feeling other, more horrible things. So she suppresses her feelings and refuses to engage emotionally with anyone as a sort of protective strategy for not having to think about the death of her father. Her cousin Graham is very blunt about this, and he says, "My mother says that your mother says that since your father died, you won't give anyone a hug, not even her, and she thinks you've become emotionally stunted." So these passages are comic, but this does not hide the fact that Fidge is a traumatized child struggling to process this parental loss. Her adventure into the land of the Wimbley woos, into fiction, gives her a fantasy framework for processing her grief. And this means that Wed Wabbit fits very firmly into the category of texts that offer hope and healing from trauma as a feature of the narrative, both for the characters and perhaps for the reader as well. So what I'd like to do now is, I'm not going to overanalyze these passages for you, but I'd like to pick out 3 different passages from the novel and suggest ways that you can interpret these through a trauma lens. And there's opportunity for you to do this in your own time if you would like to. The first passage is from the part of the novel where depicting Minnie's car accident. The passage describes the noise. The noise was horrible. A scream from mum and a screech of brakes, an ugly thud, the crunch of glass, a shocked chorus of yells from passers-by, but the silence was worse. So I would invite you to look at the language of this passage and think about how this the language that's used marks a disruption in the way that the novel is narrated. The short sentences that are used, the repetition, this juxtaposition between noise and silence. How do all of these things work together to represent this traumatic moment for Fidge and for Minnie? The second passage I would like you to look at, and there's not just one passage where this happens, there are multiple moments in the novel where Ella the elephant and Dr. Carrot come in with their sort of their therapeutic advice. So Ella says to Fidge, you're very tense, so roll all of those tensions into a great big ball and throw it to me. Fidge made a half-hearted rolling gesture and then lobbed the invisible ball to Ella, who mimed catching something incredibly heavy. Such a heavy weight, darling. And now do you feel better? I'd invite you to think about the function that Ella the elephant and Dr. Carrot have in the novel. Do their therapeutic insights help? Do they have any use? Are they there, or are they there as comic relief? Is the text saying that the sort of therapeutic help they provide is useful, or is it inviting you to mock it, or perhaps both? And finally, this passage is from the end of the novel, and it describes old Wimbley land sapped of all its colour. It says this was a scene from an unused colouring book. Trees the same shade as train tracks, and lakes as pale as hedges. Fidge realised something else. Wimbley land was deathly quiet. So this happens because Wed Wabbit, who's the sort of new dictator, who's very angry and probably scared as well, you could argue, is slowly sapping all of the colour out of Wimbley land and growing larger and larger and larger as this happens. And again, I'd invite you to think about how we can interpret this feature of the narrative through a trauma lens. So in what sense is how can we interpret the fact that his anger means that all of the colour is sucked out of the land? How can we talk about the fact that it imposes silence on the land? And how can we see what happens with Wed Wabbit and his anger and his fear and the sucking of the colour out of the land as representative for Fidge's emotional state, or for Minnie's emotional state as she recovers in hospital from her car accident? So like I said, I'd invite you to consider all of these passages and all of these features of the narrative yourselves. And I'm going to finish there. Like I said, these are my references. These are the key texts that I've used today. I'm also going to send out these slides, so you'll be able to refer back to these. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for having me come and speak to you. And I look forward to meeting some of you and answering some of your questions in a couple of weeks' time.